Eli wasn't like most 14-year-old boys in his small, close-knit town. While his friends spent their afternoons playing video games or riding bikes, Eli often found himself keeping an eye on his mother, Maria, who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Their small home was cozy but humble, and every penny counted. Maria worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses in the morning and serving at a diner in the evenings. Despite her fatigue, she always made time to remind Eli of the importance of kindness. Kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything, she would say as they shared their simple dinners together. Eli took those words to heart, though he hadn't yet realized how powerful they could be. One day, as Eli carried a bag of groceries home from the local market, he noticed his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Smith, struggling to carry a heavy box up her porch steps. Mrs. Smith was a reclusive woman in her late 70s who had moved into the neighborhood a few years ago. With her snow-white hair and quiet demeanor, she kept to herself, rarely seen outside except for her weekly trips to town. Without hesitation, Eli ran up to her. "Do you need help with that?" he asked, setting his groceries down. Mrs. Smith hesitated for a moment, looking surprised. Then her face softened, and she nodded. "Thank you, young man. These old bones aren't what they used to be." Eli lifted the box with ease and followed her inside. Her house was much larger than Eli's, but it was dusty and dimly lit, with stacks of newspapers and books lining the walls. A faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, likely from the candle burning on the coffee table. "Where should I put this?" Eli asked. "Right there on the counter will do," Mrs. Smith replied. As he set the box down, she smiled for the first time, and Eli noticed how warm her eyes were despite the sadness that seemed to linger in them. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't usually have visitors. It's nice to have someone lend a hand." Eli shrugged modestly. "It's no big deal. If you ever need help with anything, just let me know. I live right across the street." From that day on, Eli made a habit of checking in on Mrs. Smith. He would stop by after school to see if she needed help with groceries, yard work, or small repairs around the house. Sometimes he simply sat with her on the porch, listening to her stories about her younger years. She had been a school teacher and had traveled to many places before settling in the town. Her tales of adventure fascinated Eli, and he grew fond of her gentle voice and thoughtful manner. Mrs. Smith, in turn, began to look forward to Eli's visits. She would bake him cookies or offer him a cool glass of lemonade while they chatted. Her once lonely days became brighter with Eli's presence, and her home slowly began to feel less empty. One Saturday, Eli noticed that Mrs. Smith's garden was overgrown with weeds. Without waiting for her to ask, he borrowed a pair of gloves and a small spade from his mother and set to work. Smith came outside to find him kneeling in the dirt, pulling up stubborn weeds and planting new flowers she had left in pots. "You don't have to do all this, Eli," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I know," Eli replied, wiping the sweat from his brow, "but I want to. It looks nicer this way, don't you think?" She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's beautiful. You're a good boy, Eli." Though Eli enjoyed helping Mrs. Smith, he didn't realize how much it meant to her. To him, it was simply a way to spend his free time and make someone happy. But to Mrs. Smith, Eli's kindness was a gift she hadn't expected, a reminder that even in her quiet, lonely life, there was still room for connection and hope. As the weeks passed, Eli's routine of helping Mrs. Smith became a part of his life. He began to notice how much needed doing around her house. The gutters were clogged with leaves, the old picket fence was leaning dangerously, and some of the light fixtures inside flickered whenever she turned them on. It didn't feel right to leave these things undone, so Eli decided to tackle them one at a time. On a particularly sunny afternoon, Eli hauled a rickety old ladder out of Mrs. Smith's garage. He had convinced her to let him clean the gutters, despite her protests about how dangerous it might be. "You'll hurt yourself up there," she said, wringing her hands nervously as Eli balanced on the ladder. "I'll be fine," Eli replied with a grin. "You've got plenty of sticks and leaves up here, Mrs. Smith." I bet these gutters haven't been cleaned in years. They haven't, she admitted, shaking her head. I just don't have the energy anymore. By the time Eli finished, the gutters were clear, and Mrs. Smith's relief was visible. She thanked him profusely, insisting he sit down and have a slice of the apple pie she had baked that morning. As they sat together in her cozy kitchen, Mrs. Smith began to talk about her late husband, George. We used to do everything around the house together, she said, her voice heavy with nostalgia. George loved fixing things. I suppose I lost my enthusiasm for it after he passed. Eli listened quietly, sensing the depth of her sorrow. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose someone you loved so deeply. Her stories gave him a glimpse into a life filled with joy and love, but also the pain of losing it. The more time Eli spent at Mrs. Smith's house, the more he understood how much his presence mattered to her. It wasn't just about fixing the gutters or tidying the garden, it was about the companionship they shared. She had begun to look healthier, smiling more often and walking with a lighter step. Eli, too, found joy in their growing friendship. It was satisfying to see the changes in her home and in her spirit. One rainy day after school, Eli found Mrs. Smith sitting in her living room, surrounded by old photo albums. She waved him over, and he joined her on the plush but faded couch. Together, they flipped through the pages, looking at black and white photographs of her younger days. That's me on my wedding day, she said, pointing to a picture of a radiant young woman in a simple lace dress. And that's George. Eli studied the man in the photograph, a tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a kind smile. You both look so happy, he said. We were, Mrs. Smith replied, her voice trembling slightly. He was my best friend. We dreamed of growing old together, but life had other plans. Eli didn't know what to say, so he simply rested his hand on hers. She gave him a watery smile and squeezed his fingers gently. After that day, Mrs. Smith began opening up even more. She talked about her years as a teacher, the children she had mentored, and the places she had visited. Eli soaked up her stories like a sponge, marveling at how much life she had lived. One afternoon, as Eli finished painting a section of the picket fence, Mrs. Smith brought out 2 glasses of iced tea. They sat together on the porch steps, enjoying the cool breeze. You remind me of George, she said suddenly. Eli blinked in surprise. Me? Yes, she said, her eyes distant. He had the same sense of kindness and determination. He would have liked you. Eli felt a warm glow at her words. Thanks, Mrs. Smith. That means a lot. That evening, as Eli walked home, he thought about how much he had learned from Mrs. Smith. She had a quiet strength and resilience that inspired him. He was glad he had taken the time to help her, not just because of the work he'd done, but because of the bond they had formed. What Eli didn't know was that Mrs. Smith had begun making plans that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. A few weeks later, Mrs. Smith called Eli over after school, her voice carrying a peculiar mix of excitement and nervousness. When he arrived, she was sitting at her kitchen table, which was covered with envelopes and papers neatly arranged in piles. Eli couldn't help but notice how serious she looked, though her usual warmth was still there. Eli, dear, she began, motioning for him to sit. I've been thinking about something very important, and I'd like to talk to you about it. Eli felt a knot of worry in his stomach. Is everything okay? She nodded, her hand smoothing the edge of one of the envelopes. More than okay, thanks to you. These past few months have been some of the happiest I've had in years, and that's because of your kindness. You've reminded me what it feels like to have family, even if it's not by blood. Eli's cheeks flushed. I'm glad I could help, Mrs. Smith. You're like family to me too. Her face softened at his words, and she reached across the table to pat his hand. I want to do something for you, Eli, something I think George would have wanted as well. She handed him one of the envelopes, and Eli hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter and a check with an amount that made his jaw drop. He stared at the number, then at her, unsure of what to say. That's for your mother, Mrs. Smith explained gently. I've set aside $2,500 to help her with whatever she needs, bills, groceries, or anything else that will make her life a little easier. Eli's eyes widened. But, Mrs. Smith, that's too much. I can't let you. She raised a hand to stop him, her expression firm but kind. You can, and you will. This isn't charity, Eli, it's a thank you. Your mother has raised a remarkable young man, and I know how hard she works. This is my way of honoring her and the love she's poured into you. Eli swallowed hard, emotions swirling in his chest. He wanted to protest, but deep down, he knew how much this would mean to his mother. Thank you, he said finally, his voice thick. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, she replied, smiling. But there's more. Eli blinked. More. Mrs. Smith slid another envelope across the table. This one is for you. I've arranged to cover your college tuition when the time comes. Eli stared at her, his heart pounding. College? But I'm only 14. And time flies faster than you think, she interjected, her smile widening. You have a bright future ahead of you, Eli, and I want to make sure you have every opportunity to chase your dreams. Whether you want to be a teacher, an artist, or anything else, this will help you get there. Tears welled up in Eli's eyes, and he looked down at the envelope, unable to process the enormity of what she was offering. Mrs. Smith, I don't even know how to thank you for this. She leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. You've already thanked me, Eli. Every time you pulled a weed, fixed a broken latch, or simply sat and listened, you gave me something I can never repay. You gave me my life back. Eli wiped his eyes, feeling overwhelmed but deeply grateful. I promise I'll work hard and make you proud. I already am proud, she said, her voice gentle. Now let's have some tea and celebrate. We've got plenty of time to talk about the future. As they sat together, sipping tea and sharing stories, Eli couldn't help but feel that his life had changed forever. Mrs. Smith's generosity wasn't just about money, it was about belief. She believed in him, in his potential, and in the kindness that had brought them together. That belief was the most precious gift of all. Word spread quickly through their small neighborhood about what Mrs. Smith had done for Eli and his mother. Maria, overwhelmed with gratitude, visited Mrs. Smith the following evening with tears in her eyes. She brought a homemade pie as a token of thanks, but she knew no gift could ever truly express her appreciation. You've changed our lives, Maria said, her voice trembling as she held Mrs. Smith's hands tightly. I don't know how we can ever repay you. Mrs. Smith smiled, her usual calm and grace shining through. Maria, you've already done more than you know by raising such a thoughtful, kind son. That boy has been a blessing to me, and this is simply my way of honoring that. Though Maria insisted she didn't need to do so much, Mrs. Smith assured her that it brought her joy to give back. The two women talked late into the night, sharing stories of their struggles and triumphs. A newfound friendship blossomed between them, built on mutual respect and gratitude. As the days turned into weeks, Eli began to notice changes not just in his home life but in his own perspective. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream big. He started imagining what college might be like and what he might do with his life. Mrs. Smith had sparked something in him, an understanding that kindness and effort could lead to extraordinary opportunities. Eli threw himself into his schoolwork with renewed energy, determined to make the most of the chance he had been given. He started helping his classmates with their assignments and even volunteered to clean up the playground after school. His teachers noticed the change, praising his dedication and leadership. But Eli wasn't doing it for recognition, he was doing it because he felt inspired to pay Mrs. Smith's kindness forward. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Smith invited Eli and Maria over for tea. When they arrived, they found her seated on the porch with a small stack of letters in her lap. She handed one to Eli with a twinkle in her eye. This came for you today, she said. Eli tore open the envelope to find a handwritten note from one of his classmates, thanking him for helping her understand math problems she had been struggling with. You're the best, Eli, it read. Thanks for believing in me. Mrs. Smith watched him with pride. See what happens when you share kindness, Eli? It multiplies. What you've done for me is rippling out into the world, more than you know. Eli smiled, holding the note tightly. I guess I never thought about it that way. Maria chimed in, her voice warm. You've got a gift, Eli. And it's not just your kindness, it's your heart. You make people feel like they matter. The conversation turned to lighter topics, and they spent the afternoon laughing and enjoying each other's company. For Mrs. Smith, moments like this were priceless, a stark contrast to the quiet loneliness she had once known. For Eli, they were reminders of the power of connection. Over the coming months, Mrs. Smith continued to mentor Eli, sharing her wisdom and encouragement. She introduced him to books she had loved as a teacher, sparking his interest in literature and history. Each book felt like a new adventure, and Eli soaked up every lesson like a sponge. One day, while sorting through her belongings, Mrs. Smith found an old telescope that had belonged to her late husband. She polished it carefully and called Eli over. I want you to have this, she said, handing him the telescope. George and I used to stargaze for hours. It's one of my favorite memories, and I think you'll enjoy it too. Eli was awestruck as he accepted the gift. That night, he and Maria took the telescope outside and pointed it at the clear, starry sky. As they gazed at the constellations, Eli felt a sense of wonder and possibility he had never experienced before. He thought about Mrs. Smith, her stories, and the lessons she had taught him. Her kindness had opened his eyes not just to the world around him, but to the potential within himself. And he promised silently, under the blanket of stars, to carry her legacy forward. As the seasons shifted from summer to fall, Eli and Mrs. Smith's bond continued to deepen. Her home, once a place of solitude, was now filled with warmth and laughter. Neighbors began to notice the change in her, and she became more involved in the community. Though she still cherished her quiet moments, she seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Eli, too, found himself growing in ways he hadn't imagined. He took every opportunity to help others, inspired by the impact Mrs. Smith had made on his life. Whether it was raking leaves for an elderly neighbor or tutoring younger students at school, Eli discovered the joy of giving without expecting anything in return. His actions didn't go unnoticed. Teachers, friends, and even strangers began to speak of the boy with the unshakable kindness and determined spirit. One brisk autumn morning, Mrs. Smith asked Eli to join her in the garden. She handed him a packet of bulbs and a trowel, explaining that they would plant daffodils together. As they worked side by side, she spoke of seasons and sang cycles, how everything in life had its time and place. These flowers won't bloom until spring, she said, patting the soil gently. But when they do, they'll be a reminder of the care we put into them today. That's how life works, Eli. What you nurture now will grow into something beautiful later. Eli nodded, understanding her words on a deeper level. He thought about his studies, his family, and his dreams for the future. Everything he did now was a seed, and he was determined to tend to them with care. As winter approached, Mrs. Smith began to slow down. She assured Eli it was simply the cold weather making her tired, but he couldn't help but worry. He started visiting more often, bringing her books from the library and making sure she had everything she needed. In turn, she continued to encourage him, reminding him of his potential and the importance of staying true to his values. One snowy evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Mrs. Smith handed Eli a small wooden box. Inside, he found a collection of keepsakes, photographs, letters, and trinkets from her travels. At the very top was a handwritten note addressed to him. "This is for you, Eli," she said softly. "When the time comes, I want you to have these. They're pieces of my life, memories that shaped who I am. I hope they remind you that even the smallest moments can have meaning." Eli's throat tightened as he looked through the box, each item a glimpse into her remarkable journey. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith. I'll take good care of it." She smiled, her eyes twinkling despite her weariness. "I know you will." The holidays arrived, and Eli and Maria invited Mrs. Smith to their home for Christmas dinner. It was a simple celebration, but the joy in the room was palpable. They exchanged thoughtful gifts, shared stories, and sang carols by candlelight. For the first time in years, Mrs. Smith felt like she was part of a family again. As the new year began, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he had been given not just a gift, but a responsibility. Mrs. Smith had shown him the power of kindness, and it was now up to him to carry that forward. He approached each day with a sense of purpose, determined to honor her faith in him. When spring arrived, the daffodils they had planted together bloomed in vibrant clusters. Mrs. Smith and Eli stood in the garden, admiring their handiwork. The sight was breathtaking, a sea of yellow that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Look at that," she said, her voice filled with awe. "All because we took the time to plant them." Eli smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection to the moment. "They're beautiful. Just like you said they'd be." Mrs. Smith's health began to decline that summer, but she faced it with grace and acceptance. Eli and Maria continued to support her, ensuring she was never alone. On a warm evening in late August, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mrs. Smith passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire community mourned her loss, but Eli chose to focus on celebrating her life. At her memorial, he spoke of her kindness, her wisdom, and the lessons she had taught him. He vowed to live in a way that honored her memory, spreading the light she had shared with him. Years later, as Eli stood on the stage at his college graduation, he thought of Mrs. Smith. The telescope she had given him sat on a shelf in his dorm room, a constant reminder of the woman who had believed in him when he didn't yet believe in himself. He looked out at the crowd, where his mother sat beaming with pride, and knew that everything he had achieved was thanks to the kindness of one extraordinary neighbor. Eli's life was forever shaped by the bond they had shared, a bond that proved that even the smallest acts of compassion could change the world. And as he moved forward into the next chapter of his life, he carried her lessons with him, planting seeds of kindness wherever he went.